Hi class, and welcome to chapter 13, which will be on the central nervous system. Pay close attention to these lecture videos because I'm going to try to skip over a lot and just focus on the things I want you to know. There's a lot of chapters in this module, so I will try to just focus on a few key items. In general, when we go over all these lecture PowerPoints, try to focus on just anatomical structures and make up these systems. If I want you to know any functions, I'll try to point that out as well. So your central nervous system is made up of your brain and spinal cord, and we do use rostral and caudal to kind of directionally term these terms that are unique to the central nervous system. So rostral always means toward the nose, and caudal means toward the tail. So what does the brain do? You should know this. Your brain controls your heart rate, your respiratory rate, your blood pressure, the autonomic nervous system, which is everything that happens on a subconscious level automatically in the body, the endocrine system, which is all your hormones, and it's also involved in the innervation of the head through different cranial nerves. It performs more complex neural functions like intelligence, consciousness, memory, sensory motor, integration, emotion, behavior, and socialization. And we can classify the brain into these four regions, which again, I want you to focus on these regions: the brainstem, which is the midbrain, pons, and medulla, the cerebellum, the diencephalon, and then the cerebrum, which is composed of the right and left central hemispheres. There's spaces in the brain called ventricles, which are just expansions of the brain central cavity. They're filled with cerebrospinal fluid and lined with ependymal cells, which create that cerebrospinal fluid. They're all continuous and connect with each other, and they are also continuous with the central canal of the spinal cord. The two lateral ventricles are located in the cerebral hemispheres. The third ventricle is kind of in the center, connecting the two. The cerebral aqueduct connects the third to the fourth ventricle, and then the fourth ventricle kind of lies in the hindbrain, right in front of the cerebellum, and this will be continuous with the central canal of the spinal cord. So these are the ventricles of the brain. They're spaces filled with cerebrospinal fluid, and they're all connected to each other. The organization of the brain is into gray and white matter. The gray matter is more centrally located, and that contains the neuronal cell bodies. The white matter is externally located, containing the axons. There's an additional layer of gray matter external to the white matter as well. And then the cortex is the outer layer of gray matter formed from neuronal cell bodies, which is located in the cerebrum and cerebellum. And you can see this here, the pattern of gray and white matter. The cortex of gray matter, you can see kind of on the exterior surface, the white matter, and then the internal gray matter. And this pattern of gray and white matter is continuous all the way from the cerebrum and then down through the spinal cord, where you can see the inner gray matter kind of in the shape of a butterfly, and then the outer white matter surrounding it. So the brainstem is the midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata. The general functions of the brainstem is it's the passageway for fiber tracts between the cerebrum and the spinal cord. It's heavily involved with the innervation of the face and head, where you have 10 of the 12 pairs of cranial nerves being attached to it. It produces automatic behaviors, and it integrates auditory and visual reflexes. So here's the brainstem in bold: the midbrain, the pons, and then the medulla oblongata. So midbrain is located here, the pons, and then the medulla oblongata will be continuous with the spinal cord. The medulla oblongata is the most caudal part. It's continuous with the spinal cord, and a part of your fourth ventricle lies dorsal to the superior half of the medulla. You have different cranial nerves coming off of the medulla. You don't need to know that, but here's a look again of the medulla oblongata located down here. You can kind of see each part with a different color, with the thalamus, hypothalamus, midbrain, pons, and then the medulla oblongata. So knowing this general anatomical structure of the thalamus, hypothalamus, midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata, you should know that general structure. The core of the medulla contains the reticular formation, which contains some nuclei of autonomic functions. There's visceral centers, which is where your cardiac center, vasomotor center is, medullary respiratory center is. This is where you have a center for hiccuping, sneezing, swallowing, and coughing. So again, knowing the general structure of this, here we have the diencephalon, which is made of the thalamus. We'll get to that. The midbrain, what makes up the midbrain, the pons, and then the medulla oblongata. And then you can see many pairs of cranial nerves in yellow coming off of this section. The pons is then the bridge between the midbrain and the medulla oblongata. It contains several cranial nerves as well, which you don't need to know the exacts of those. The midbrain then lies between the diencephalon and the pons. There's a cerebral aqueduct, which is the central cavity of the midbrain. There are cerebral peduncles located on the ventral surface of the brain that contain pyramidal or different nervous system tracts. And the superior cerebral peduncles connect the midbrain to the cerebellum. The midbrain also contains the corpora quadremina, which is the largest of the nuclei. These different types of colliculi act in visual reflexes and different reflex responses to sound. And again, I just show you the picture of this brainstem because in general, I just want you to know what it looks like, how to label it, and what's the order and kind of the layout of the brainstem. The cerebellum then is located dorsal to the pons and the medulla. It works with smoothing and coordinating body movements and especially helps to maintain equilibrium. So this is the cerebellum's main job. It consists of two cerebellar hemispheres. They're separated by fissures and there's different lobes. So this is a look at the cerebellum. It's located kind of behind the fourth ventricle. So here's your fourth ventricle and the cerebellum is located behind it. It's made up of white and gray matter, which arrange itself into these tree-like branches called arbor vitae. So this is your cerebellum. So you can see that cerebellum here. So this is how it's arranged into the cortex of the gray matter, and the arbor vitae makes that white matter, which kind of looks like tree branches. The cerebellum works to coordinate body movements. It receives three types of information on equilibrium, movements of limbs, neck, and trunk, and information from the cerebral cortex. So understanding the general functions of the cerebellum might be important, a test question, but it works with all the coordinating movements, receiving information, and then how to kind of move the intended body positions. There's a higher cognitive function of the cerebellum, which helps to learn a new motor skill, and it participates in cognition like language, problem solving, and task planning. The cerebral peduncles or cerebellar peduncles, these are just tracts connecting the cerebellum to the brainstem. So we have different nervous fibers to and from the cerebellum, which are ipsilateral, meaning they will travel on the same side. Then the diencephalon forms the central core of the forebrain. These are the main structures in the diencephalon, which I do want you to know. And that's kind of what we'll go through now. So here we're looking at the diencephalon here, which is made of the thalamus, epithalamus, and hypothalamus. So understanding these parts of the diencephalon. So the thalamus makes up about 80% of the diencephalon. The big thing about the thalamus is it acts as a relay station for incoming sensory information, and every part of the brain communicates with the cerebral cortex, will relay signals through these thalamic nuclei. So the big thing about the thalamus is it's your body's relay center. It takes in all sensory information and sends it to the appropriate part of the rest of the brain. It's the gateway to the cerebral cortex, and the nuclei of the neurons here will organize and amplify or tone down signals. So this is the thalamus, and it has different kind of bodies or nuclei throughout it. The hypothalamus then lies between the optic chiasm and the mammillary bodies. The pituitary gland projects inferiorly from it. It's the main visceral control center of the body. This is your hypothalamus. And these are some of the main functions of the hypothalamus, which you should know. It controls your endocrine system, the sleep-wake cycles, behavior, hunger and thirst, body temperature. Controlling the autonomic nervous system is everything that happens on the subconscious level, and it helps with forming memory. So here's a look at the nuclei of the thalamus and the hypothalamus, but the thalamus is located right here. And these are the different nuclei, which just are the different bodies of neurons that control different functions. And the thalamus, which again is this upper part with all the colorful circles, it's connected to the pituitary gland, which will secrete different hormones. And it's connected via this infundibulum, which is this little stalk. The epithalamus forms the roof of the third ventricle, and it includes the pineal gland, which secretes melatonin, and this controls your circadian rhythm, and it's under the influence of the hypothalamus. Then the cerebrum is about 83% of the brain mass. It has fissures, which are deep grooves that separate major regions. There's the transverse fissure, which separates the cerebrum from the cerebellum, and the longitudinal fissure separates the cerebral hemispheres. The sulci are grooves on the surface of the cerebral hemispheres, and then the gyri are twisted ridges between the sulci, and the prominent gyri and sulci are very similar in all people. The deeper sulci divide the cerebrum into lobes, and the lobes are all named for the skull bones which overlie them, and I'll show you a picture of this. And there's a central sulcus that separates the frontal and parietal lobes, and it's bordered by two gyri, which are important. And these gyri are in your lab practicum 4 master list as well. So knowing a picture like this is very important. So this labels all the different lobes. It explains what a fissure is, what the gyrus is, and what a sulcus is. So a fissure is a deep sulcus, and a sulcus is just a general kind of valley between two gyri. And here are the different lobes: frontal lobe, parietal lobe, temporal lobe, and occipital lobe, and the different sulcuses that kind of are little kind of valleys between them. And then the precentral gyrus and the postcentral gyrus are separated by the central sulcus. And these two gyruses are important because they have very specific functions. Then we have a little bit more anatomy of the cerebral hemispheres. The insula is the deep kind of the deep lobe within the lateral sulcus. And then these are the lobes of the cerebral cortex. And you can see the insula is kind of the lobe deeper into, so you would have to kind of reflect back the temporal lobe to see the insula. The cerebral cortex is the home of our conscious mind. It enables us to be aware of ourselves and our sensations, initiate and control voluntary movements, and communicate, remember, and understand. The cerebral cortex is composed of gray matter. It folds, it triples in sides. So this is the cerebral cortex. There's functional regions. Traditionally studied brain injured people and animals can give us some functional regions of the cerebral cortex. And these two slides are great to look at because they tell you kind of the basic part of the brain and the function. And this is kind of as far as I would ask you to know about these structures. Protection of the brain is protected by the skull, meninges, cerebrospinal fluid, and the blood-brain barrier. The meninges cover and protect the central nervous system, and they enclose and protect the vessels that supply the central nervous system. They contain cerebrospinal fluid. The dura mater is the strongest of the meningeal. It's composed of 2 layers. So here you should know the meninges around the brain. The dura mater is number 1, the arachnoid mater, and then the Pia Mater. So understanding these meningeal layers that protect the brain are very important. So I'll let you guys look over this. The partitions of the dura mater, you do not need to know this. The arachnoid mater is the second layer beneath the dura mater. It's made of the arachnoid villi. The Pia Mater is the delicate connective tissue that clings slightly to the surface of the brain. And then cerebrospinal fluid, you should know what this is. It fills the hollow cavities, provides a liquid cushion, as well as these functions you should know about the cerebrospinal fluid. It's formed in the choroid plexus, which is composed of those ependymal cells, and it arises from blood. So this is the formation, location, and circulation of cerebrospinal fluid coming from the choroid plexus and then traveling through the ventricles. The blood-brain barrier prevents most blood-borne toxins from entering the brain. It's not an absolute barrier because some things can still pass through. The functions of the spinal cord then, spinal nerves are attached to it. It provides a 2-way conduction pathway, and it's the major center for reflexes. And the spinal cord is located running through the vertebral canal, extending from the foramen magnum to L1 and L2. You should know these basic anatomical features of the spinal cord. and you can see them labeled there. These are the spinal cord segments with the spinal nerves coming off of them. The spinal cord has 2 deep grooves running through it. There's white matter that contains different fibers. The gray matter is in the shape of an H with dorsal and ventral horns. So understanding a picture like this is very important as well. I could include a picture like this in a lecture exam or a lab exam, just knowing where things are labeled with the spinal meninges and everything else. And here's another great look at the anatomy of the spinal cord. You will see a picture like this on a lab exam or a lecture exam. The gray matter of the spinal cord then is primarily neuronal cell bodies and some non-myelinated axons. Here's the gray matter divided into different regions, whether it's the somatic, visceral, or motor. So you should understand and be able to label a picture like this as well, knowing that sensory information comes in the dorsal side and motor information goes out the ventral side. Protection of the spinal cord continues with the same layers that the brain had, and I'll let you guys see that. This is where a lumbar puncture occurs to take out some of the cerebral spinal fluid to measure for different levels. You have different sensory and motor pathways which carry information. You don't need to know the specifics of these motor pathways. So I'm going to kind of skip over this. The descending and ascending pathways take information to the brain and take it back down. So I think that's going to be it. You should know some of these brain dysfunctions, the stroke, Alzheimer's disease, understanding those, anencephaly, spina bifida, and cerebral palsy. Other than that, you don't need to know anything else. So thank you for listening, guys, and I'll see you for chapter 14.